Good day, everybody. My name is Joseph Romero Akande, and today we'll be covering a paper club presentation on a research paper titled Beyond Herd Immunity Against Strategic Attackers. And let's jump right into it. To start with, we'll be going through the overview. In this presentation today, we're going to be covering the introduction, which would cover the background concepts and some questions, the methodology, what they did, how they did it, some experiments and simulations they ran. We'll then go into the results and findings, the critical analysis of the paper from my point of view, and the project's impact, future work, and conclusion. So without further ado, let's get into it. In the words of the authors, malicious software continuously threatens internet stability, posing a wide variety of challenges to system admins and users. As such, viral models for the diffusion of malicious software have been a part of mainstream research in the field of network security. This paper addresses the issue of the strategic attacker by proposing a model that goes beyond the traditional understanding of herd immunity by taking into consideration both the endogenous and exogenous infections. Now, what does this mean? To start this presentation, I'm going to take you through, a general understanding of the concepts that this paper wants you to have to understand the paper, right? And we'll start with malware. We all know what malware is. Malicious software, any code added, changed, removed from a system to intentionally cause harm, right? This malware is basically a program or a piece of code that is missing or added to a computer system or a computer network intended to cause some type of harm, to steal information, to crash the computer, viruses, botnets, Trojan horses, stuff like that. They're all malware, right? Now, how does this malware spread? Sorry, that's where we'll come to network epidemics, right? Uh, we have two major ways malware spreads, or two ways rather, which are the exogenous and the endogenous infections, right? Now, starting with the endogenous infections, these are infections that uh, in a computer network, each node is its individual self. Now, some nodes, infections that spread in between the network, from one node to another in the network, within the network, those are endogenous infections. Now, exogenous infections are infections that start from the outside, that are brought into the network by an attacker from the outside, right? So that's the important difference you have to note there. The endogenous infections are controlled within the network, while exogenous infections are controlled from outside the network remotely, right? And that brings us to a specific type, no, not a specific type, but how have we been combating these infections up until this point? One of the major ways infections are fought, or one of the concepts that we use, is herd immunity. Herd immunity occurs when a large fraction of the population of devices is immune against a virus or a malware. Now, to explain this, I want you to think of biological infections. How do those work, right? Looking at this diagram here, we're going to call this person here ground zero. He is the first person to get infected. And from this point onwards, I want you to imagine each person here as a computer, as a node in a network, right? Now, this person is currently infected with a virus, for example, and it spreads it to that person, spreads it to that person. These people are susceptible. They can also contract the virus. So if, for example, this node makes connection with this node, it can infect it, right? And that is basically how infections spread in a network. Now, what is herd immunity? Herd immunity is when some of these nodes, or not some, when most of these nodes, the majority of them, are immune to that virus. Now, looking at the same visual here, we have ground zero, and then we have a bunch of immunized nodes, right? So all these nodes have taken some type of countermeasure to fight the viruses. And now you're looking at it. This person used to be susceptible. He spread the virus to him, but now the virus has nowhere else to go because everyone else that is susceptible to the virus has no direct link to the infected nodes, right? So that is how herd immunity works. When the majority of the nodes or the computers in a network are immunized or are immune to a virus, though some the susceptible ones who haven't immunized have a greater chance of surviving an infection, right? Their infection probability is really low. However, herd immunity itself has a flaw. It has a flaw because each node here has individual autonomy. They are choosing not to immunize, and these are choosing to immunize. So each of them is a decision maker. They're making their own individual decisions to not immunize. And what that means is some nodes in this network will always remain susceptible. That introduces us to the concept of the strategic attacker. Now, in the new age, we've had, we're starting to see a new trend where attackers don't just send their, their attacks, their infections out into the wild and hoping it infects people, right? They are scanning these networks. They're scanning the networks and looking for the particular nodes that are infectable, that are susceptible to their viruses. So instead of looking for or just throwing the virus in and hoping it will hit, right? Now they're scanning the entire network for these guys, right? For the guys that are not vaccinated, the guys that are not immune to their virus, and then infecting them directly. So that is what the strategic attacker does. They invest their attack budget towards just the vulnerable users and get those networks infected. But uh, we also have countermeasures which were lent to, you know, what are these countermeasures that, the types of vaccines, basically, excuse me, the types of vaccines, we said these people are vaccinated or they're immune to the virus. What does that mean? What that means is networks have adapted to fight against malware in different ways, right? Vaccination being the most popular one. And we have two types of vaccinations, lightweight and heavyweight. When you think of lightweight vaccination, I want you to think of your regular antivirus, right? Your Avast, and other antiviruses out there, These antiviruses are lightweight. They operate through a concept which we know as the SIS model, which is a susceptible, infected, susceptible model in which they rotate between getting infected by these antiviruses, updating themselves and getting rid of that virus and turning susceptible again, and then getting infected again. So it's this loop, right? However, when it comes to heavyweight vaccination, there are very, very stringent, there are extreme methods of getting rid of viruses, rebooting your entire network, cutting off those nodes that are infected, fresh installs and stuff like that. So those are heavyweight vaccinations. That is when you truly get rid of these attacks. Now, in my opinion, looking at this paper, I believe the main problem that this research seeks to address is the inadequacy of traditional herd immunity in protecting against strategic attackers. Now, we've looked at how herd immunity works, but it doesn't work against the strategic attacker. So what do you aim to solve? We are looking for the impact of both endogenous and exogenous infections on the infection probability of a network. How does the presence of the strategic attacker alter how the infection is spread? The countermeasures these nodes should adopt when they're making their individual decisions, and under what conditions do network infections reach unstable or stable equilibrium, right? And how does this affect long-term vulnerability? So we know what they want to do. We have the background, but what did they do? How did they come across? How did they solve or aim to solve this problem? First, they created an analytical model. The authors of the paper, they created an analytical model which proposed, they proposed an analytical model which captures the positive and negative externalities associated with countermeasures in security games. So basically, they created their own threat model. They created their own virus, so to speak, that accounts for both, that has both the exogenous and endogenous infections at the same time, simultaneously, right? They created that, and that's one of the major contributions of this paper. We'll get into it. Then they had the infection probability assessment. So they provided closed form solutions to their own threat model, right? They also proposed a vaccination game, which is basically what should a node do when they're making their own decisions? Do they follow the crowd and vaccinate at that moment, or do they avoid and stick with herd immunity and hope that's enough, right? So they proposed a vaccination game in which these individual nodes can look at what's happening in the network and then make their own decisions of that. And then lastly, they performed some simulations in which experiments were put into a malware simulator, which is similar to the Mirai botnet, the Mirai excuse me, the Mirai botnet is one of the most infamous botnets of the past decade or so, in which the botnet was deployed and shut down a lot of stuff around the world. But yeah, they created a simulator with the Mirai botnet to test their solutions to their own threat model. Now, the system description. Start with they consider the relative cost, which is C of n. Given as C of n, that's the relative cost, which is the cost each node, what it would cost each node to vaccinate against the attack. So C of n is given as P, which is the fraction of the time the user will be infected. That is if the user is not already vaccinated. So the relative cost of vaccination for a non-vaccinated user is the fraction of time in which the user is infected. So that's is your relative cost for that. Otherwise, if the user is vaccinated, the relative cost C of n is given as V over H, where V is the cost of unit time for the vaccination over the cost per time while infected. And then they proposed their threat model, right? Which was given as lambda, which is the power of the attacker. And then the infection rate per node was lambda of n, where n is the number of nodes in the system. And, excuse me, and this was given as the threat model is lambda of n is equals to, I'm pretty sure this is lambda 2 or n all over the total number of nodes, excuse me. And what's it called? Excuse me. This threat model is one of the major contributions of this paper because this threat model takes into account both the endogenous and the exogenous rates and puts them together to show that these infections can coexist and they are separated by phases, right? Then we go into the epidemic and how they define their epidemic, right? Basically, the D is the number of infected neighbors of a given node, and we assume the rate is given by gamma raised to the power of D. So this is the endogenous infection rate, is lambda to the power of D, which is the number of the infected nodes to the number of infected neighbors to a particular node, right? And for this paper, they used a multiplicative model. Now, the usual model that is used for experiments like this, we use the additive model, which is lambda plus gamma to the power of D. But this particular project, this particular paper, uses a multiplicative one. Why? Excuse me, I have an alarm. Sorry for that. By a multiplicative model where it's given as lambda gamma to the power of D. Now, why did they do this? This was done because when the strategic attacker is in place, and they are able to target particular nodes, the infection is no longer additive. There is a possibility that this can can be an exponent, basically. I don't know how to put that, but that is why we're using the multiplicative one as opposed to the additive one. This additive one will be used for the simulations, which will lead us to, one of the discussions we're going to have on this paper. But moving on for now, what is the vaccination game? The paper talks about two, they define the classic epidemic model and their epidemic model. Now, looking at this graph, this is the classic biological model, which has been used for till now, where your infection probability rises with the number of vulnerable nodes. It's as the infections increase, you see the infection probability starts to flatten out towards the end, and eventually all the nodes are infected, right? However, in the case where both the exogenous infection and endogenous infection are both present, what you have is a start in which actually the infection probability actually drops at the start of the infection. It drops as the numbers of uh, unvaccinated nodes increases, the infection probability actually drops as this is an exogenous infection. However, once this infection is now in the computer network and the strategic attacker has found, those vulnerable nodes, we have that curve right back up with the endogenous infection, which is in the network, right? So that leads us to the vaccination game. At what point should a computer node follow the network or avoid it? Should you vaccinate at a particular point or should you not? Now, right here, looking at this graph right here is our motivation to vaccinate graph. The first moment occurs under the initial regime right here, in which when the infection probability is going down up until the the first equilibrium at the relative vaccination cost right here, this right here is the relative vaccination cost for each node, what it will cost them to vaccinate. So when the infection probability is coming down, there is a motivation to vaccinate right here. There's a motivation to vaccinate as the infection probability is still pretty high. It's higher than the relative vaccination cost. So right here during this curve, each node is motivated to vaccinate. But as more nodes vaccinate and you reach the first equilibrium point, from here, this curve right here, there is no motivation to vaccinate. There are enough nodes in the network now that have been vaccinated that there is no longer a need. The herd immunity is strong enough for each node to make the decision not to vaccinate. But that would mean the strategic attacker now has those nodes to target. And once that starts happening, right here, and you hit the second equilibrium level, there is another motivation to vaccinate. And what are these equilibrium levels? What are these equilibrium points? Excuse me. Those are the points where directly to the left, there is a motivation to vaccinate, and then directly to the right, there is a motivation to not vaccinate. So first, this is the same curve here, but looking at the equilibrium now. This point is the first point, is unstable equilibrium, at this point, each node right here has the motivation to vaccinate, but around node 12, when the number of vulnerable nodes is around 12, there is a motivation to no longer vaccinate. And when that curve goes back up around 30 nodes, there is now a motivation to vaccinate again. So these equilibrium levels kind of dictate at what point, with respect to the relative vaccination cost, each node is motivated to vaccinate, right? So we're running into the experiment and the simulation. In this experiment, they created an epidemic simulator with the Mirai botnet to evaluate the network's behavior under a wide range of configurations. And the attacker starts with a particular bot which attempts to infect exogenously, and it keeps connecting up until it finds that one node that is vulnerable to the infection. And it keeps trying excuse me. It keeps trying. The simulation is run for 10,000 time units, which is enough to estimate the network steady state. And we compare the infection probability with we compare the infection probability through the simulation obtained. Basically, we take the result from the threat model and solution, and then we compare it to the simulation results itself. And in the simulation, I believe the simulation was run 12 times, not 12 times, with 12 different values, with the varying being gamma hat. On the first column, we adjust the endogenous infection rate right here. So on this column right here, we're only adjusting the endogenous rate. On this column here, we're adjusting the exogenous rate, and then this is the impact of uptime on the system, right? And the confidence interval is represented with the yellow dash here, and I was reported to about 95% confidence interval. Now, what do these simulation results mean? It basically just means at the end of this, if you look at this graph, the simulation here are the straight lines. When the endogenous rates are low, the infection drops up until about 0.5, and then it straightens out. And that is about the same for every point with the endogenous rate. So we see that the endogenous rate doesn't affect the probability as much, right? And then the exogenous rate, we see when we start with the really low exogenous rate, at first it's really low, then it spikes with a 95% confidence rate. And then the impact of uptime on the system is to be seen here. And we can see just from looking at the graphs, all these graphs are widely different. And the only parameter that's been changed here is the uptime. So we can see that uptime definitely has a significant impact on the simulation, on the network and the infections. So what do the results mean? Simulation results. This shouldn't be here. We'll come back. But yeah, the research findings. As the number of vulnerable nodes increases, the fraction of infected nodes first decreases and increases, which is what we've talked about. There's two regimes, right? The first regime is dominated by the endogenous infection, in which the fraction of infected node decreases. If you remember the first graph we talked about, right here, it decreases before it increases when it's dominated by the endogenous infection, right? That's what this is talking about. And then the next finding, as the number of vulnerable nodes increases, the infection probability is more sensitive to the endogenous infection rather than the exogenous one, which is what we talked about here. The endogenous infection affects the infection rate higher than what we can see in the exogenous rate, as we can see here, right? And then the host uptime significantly impact the fraction of the infected nodes, which we just talked about. Basically, that just means when a node is more active, it has a higher chance of being affected, which brings us to one of the first problems. Okay, we'll get to that. But basically, the discussions for this project, the first thing is when it comes to cybersecurity insurance, I believe that the results of this research imply that insurance should take into account both the positive and negative externalities derived from immunization. Basically, what that means is when you immunize, there are positive and negative impacts, right? The price / the relative cost over taking your chances with herd immunity. Also, the risk score parameterization indicates that with the results we got from this research, we can basically see that herd immunity is not as strong as we think it is, because even if the neighbors of a node are already protected, the risks of being faced by the infection is still high, right? Because the strategic attacker are able to, focus on those particular nodes. They're able to focus on those nodes in particular. So other risk scores, the standard ones that we've been using till now, are a bit out of date, to put it that way. And then the paper also makes us think of we need to start thinking of other immunization strategies beyond herd immunity, because obviously now herd immunity is just not enough. It's not enough for to protect our networks anymore. So yeah, the strength of the project. This project it brings about a new analytical model that's I believe it's more true to life, it's more realistic, uh, where the strategic attacker is, you know, these attackers, they have a finite budget, right? They have a particular number of infections they can send out per unit time. So they're not just going to waste them on uh on vaccinated nodes, excuse me, on vaccinated nodes. So I believe this is more true to life, in which strategic attackers can pick the nodes they want to infect, and their threat model also takes into account both the endogenous and exogenous infections simultaneously at the same time, and shows the relation to the infection rate. And then it also proposed the vaccination game, right, which we've talked about. And the weaknesses of this project are mostly in the differences between the uh, the simulation and their threat model. To start with, the infection probability are varied because the the threat model that they developed doesn't take into account inactive nodes, because computers do go off, they do shut down, they are turned off, and during those moments they cannot be infected. So the rates in the threat model are pretty high because it doesn't take into account the effective nodes. It also uses the multiplicative infection rate, which we talked about, while the simulator uses the more true to life Botnet additive one. And then the research also focuses on networks with a finite number of nodes, which is not as true to life as you'd like to think, because, you know, in this day and age, it's the internet. That's an infinite amount of nodes. So the project impact. I believe this project has introduced us into a new way of looking at malware and infections, because in this paper, we've considered the simultaneous attacks on both through both the endogenous and exogenous infections. We've covered strategic attacking, and we've covered a vaccination game, which allowed nodes to make their own individual decisions depending on what the infection rate in the network currently is. And I believe with that, in the future work, we can develop new security tools that take into account these parameters, right? The models that have been developed in this paper could be used to, create better cybersecurity software, and we should, better protect our networks against a strategic attacker. And for my conclusion, I can conclude that from the research presented in this paper, it can be concluded that traditional herd immunity is simply insufficient to protect against the strategic attacker in cybersecurity, obviously. This research demonstrates that while a high percentage of immune nodes in the network may offer some protection, the vulnerable nodes still remain at a very high risk because of targeted attacks, the strategic attacker. Even if they're few in number, even if it's just a couple in the network that do not invest in vaccination, those few nodes can be targeted specifically by the attacker. So I believe further research in this direction can lead to, more robust and effective security solutions in, today's day, where attackers keep evolving, they keep adding more stuff to their attacks. So I believe if we continue researching in these directions, we can get better protection for our networks. And that would lead to the end of this presentation. I did stutter a bit in a few places, so bear with me. Thank you all for listening, and do have a great day.